I want to talk a bit more about the shifting relations in the region. Maybe this is more of a comment than a question, but I do think it's the most convincing argument to me seems that Mohammed bin Salman had been sold for the past 2 years as the savior who would simply follow U.S. interests. And it seems like he, as you mentioned, has gotten too big for his britches in the eyes of the U.S. empire. And another way that this is true is not just in the brash killing of Khashoggi, which he appears to be behind potentially, but also he has improved relations with other countries like Russia. How do you think that this reflects the overall strategy of the Trump administration, which says to King Salman very openly, you couldn't last 2 weeks without us? Maybe we see a kind of moment where we're not seeing a complete shift in U.S.-Saudi relations, but rather it was Mohammed bin Salman testing the limits that he could go to. And he now knows that he can operate within a certain confines, but if he goes beyond that boundary, that then they'll pull the leash back and he could potentially be pushed out. I mean, Paul, what do you think about this shifting relationship?
There's a lot of questions there. Let me just try to focus on, well, two things. One, I don't think we should completely rule out this could have been a rogue operation. What I mean by that is there's a lot of princes and royals in Saudi Arabia that would like to bring MBS down. And who knows if this wasn't some kind of scheme to do that. So I just wouldn't rule it out. The second thing is why they cheerleaded for MBS is because in terms of the narrative of the United States for justifying global hegemony and supposedly wanting democracy and all this, it's very hard to take anything the United States says about another country and its human rights record, for example, the attacks on Venezuela, and their support for Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's just impossible to believe a word that the Americans say. As long as the Saudis are clearly the world's leader in political repression and violating human rights, and such a close ally of the United States. So MBS gave them the beginning of some kind of cover for that.
Well, what's funny is, really quickly, Marco Rubio himself, in an interview recently in the past week, he said this explicitly. He said, we can't allow Saudi Arabia to continue acts this brazen and criminal, and because if they do that as a close U.S. ally, we can't criticize Venezuela and China.
Yeah. So this was really a step too far. If they had been able to get Khashoggi back to Saudi Arabia and done it to him, they wouldn't have cared. But doing it in a way that becomes so globally publicized, and again, it looks like without permission, even though American intelligence apparently knew from intercepts that it was going to happen, they didn't. I think it's pretty clear the Saudis didn't ask to do it. So, but by doing something that's so egregious, has become so public, that it kind of breaks this facade that MBS has that there was some kind of political reform going on here, and so that hurts the American narrative. I do want to return to something else you asked earlier. I think this issue of regional hegemony, the pillars of regional hegemony coming out of World War II, were primarily Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran. So the Iranian Revolution took away one of those major pillars of the U.S. strategy for the region. They want that pillar back. The Saudi-Israeli relationship was just warmed up so much that the Saudis have virtually given up, they barely talk about the rights of the Palestinian people anymore, and the whole issue of Israel. It's a very important strategic alliance, again, because the Americans, this region exploded not so long ago. This Arab Spring was an explosion, and if it explodes once, it's going to explode again. And so they need these pillars of control in place, and no doubt Israel's a critical part of that. But if we're ending up, then I'm going to get redundant and just end up again. None of this is good for the American people. This is not something that protects people from terrorist attacks. Far from it. It makes the likelihood of terrorist attacks in the United States more likely. The volatility is not good for the American economy. It's going to make life more expensive. It might trigger a recession. Massive arms sales, most importantly, and even though the $110 billion that Trump keeps talking about is probably a crock, because I think the actual dollars of signed deals is more like about 10 billion, not 110, but whatever. There's a lot of arms sales expected from the Saudis. It's the least efficient way to develop the American economy. And of course, let's just add one more thing that nobody's talking about in this whole thing. What is the real threat to national security, even according to the Pentagon?
Climate
it's
change,
the climate change crisis. So, the whole conversation about the Saudi relationship, and it's all based on continuing a fossil fuel global economy, which is the real existential threat, not just to the Americans, but to human society as we know it. And where is any of that on the corporate media?
Wrapping up here, Paul, I'm wondering if we could just reflect on the overall politics of the region, and maybe let's conclude talking about Iran, because the Trump administration's foreign policy, it seems, is largely geared around containing and essentially trying to create a regime change, at least non-violently for right now, in Iran. War could potentially be on the horizon, but at the moment, the Trump administration withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. It's imposing brutal sanctions that go into effect next month that have already, even before they've officially gone into effect, have already really weakened the Iranian economy. So I do think that Saudi Arabia plays a key role in this, but of course, it's not just about Saudi Arabia. And in many ways, Iran is, of course, a kind of convenient scapegoat for Donald Trump and the whole, right-wing, this kind of Islamophobic wing of the Republican Party that wants to end Muslim immigration. The irony is that they are working with Saudi Arabia, which, of course, helped create al-Qaeda, elements of which supported ISIS, according to a leaked email from Hillary Clinton. And we also know that the Trump administration is trying to link Iran to ISIS and al-Qaeda in a way similar to the way that George Bush administration tried to link Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda. So just wrapping up here, I don't want you to try to predict the future, but I'm wondering what you think.
Let me give a dire potential warning
Absolutely.
about the future. Gore Vidal used to have a joke that USA stood for United States of Amnesia. Well, let's not forget 9/11. Senator Bob Graham, who was the chair of the Senate Foreign Intelligence Committee, who co-chaired the congressional investigation into the events of the 9/11 attacks, said many times, and even specifically said on The Real News in several interviews, and you can look them up, that the 9/11 attacks were facilitated, financed, and supported by the Saudi government. Graham says, he thinks right up and including the king, that this at the highest levels of the Saudi government participated in the 9/11, helped facilitate, I should say. And we know that I think all of the hijackers, or the majority of them all came from Saudi Arabia.
15 of the 19.
Yeah. Graham also says, in explicit words on The Real News, that Cheney Bush knew it was coming and didn't stop it. The potential, now, even Donald Trump, before he's elected, he's asked about 9/11. He says, oh, you want to know who's behind 9/11? He says the Saudis. This video of Trump saying this. So how come nobody cares about that? Because the Saudis can play in dirty games, the most dirty games, that help and facilitate what sections of the American foreign policy elites, sections of the CIA, what they want. So let's be wary and not forget what happened. Because if these guys really want to go after Iran, then the possibility of some other kind of false flag attack and the possibility of blaming this on the Iranians, and once again, some involvement of the Saudis, because they're the expert at this. Let's not forget how often the Saudis have threatened terror attacks. They threatened Tony Blair with a terror attack on London because they were doing a parliamentary inquiry into bribery in an arms sale. Bandar, who was the Saudi ambassador to the United States, that according to Graham's congressional investigation was involved in the 9/11 attacks. Bandar threatened Putin before the Olympics with a terrorist attack. And these are the guys that know how to do this.
Recently, there was an almost unbelievable incident a few months ago where on Twitter, in response to Canada's criticism of Saudi Arabia imprisoning human rights activists, on a KSA infographic account in Saudi Arabia, they posted an image of a plane flying toward buildings I believe it was in Toronto, in Canada. And then they immediately took it down and apologized. But the message said something like, "Don't mess with Saudi Arabia." It was almost unbelievable.
So this kind of idea that the Saudis are so horrible, and here you have these democratic Americans that would like to influence them for the better and all this, it's completely hypocritical and deceptive. The Saudis are in power, as Trump said, because of the United States. They are these degenerate human rights violators, and they're there because the United States allows it, and they become very useful for U.S. foreign policy, whether it's Afghanistan or other acts of using Al-Qaeda and terrorism, with sections of the American elites, and this section that's in power now in Washington. John Bolton's been a thread through a lot of this, worst of this stuff. So let's not forget this history, and people need to demand an end to this kind of foreign policy. Just, if you want a final sentence, the American empire ain't good for Americans.
Well, that's a great time. That's a great note to end on. That was an excellent conversation. I'm Ben Norton here at the Real News Network. I was joined by Paul Jay, who is the founder and senior editor. We were talking about the so-called special relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia in response to the recent, horrific story of the potential killing of Jamal Khashoggi, who is a Saudi columnist at the Washington Post. We were reflecting on the many subtle details in the U.S.-Saudi special relationship and looking at the potential dangers in the future. Thanks for joining us here at the Real News Network. I'm Ben Norton.